Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances across the front line, mainly centered around the Kurakhove section of the front line, where the Russians have advanced south of Selidove and in the direction of the three settlements in the south, which has now been expanded to 4 settlements as the Russians flanked Shakhtarske from the east, reaching Yasna Polyana. The answer to this flanking maneuver is that there is this rail line that goes through Novoukrayinka, splitting the settlement into 2, and through it they moved to the western parts and all the way up to Yasna Polyana. So the Russians advanced along this river line all the way up to the northern parts towards Yasna Polyana, reaching the outskirts of the settlement, and at the same time they moved in and along the road to capture the fortified positions of the Ukrainians north of Shakhtarske and half of the settlement from the rear. This gave the Russians a significant advantage, with them attacking from both the southern and northern direction. It allowed them to pincer the Ukrainian positions, squeeze them out, and gain control over the fortified positions in the northern parts. Now fighting is directed towards the fortified positions in the western parts, which would then lead to full control over Shakhtarske. Now the Russians also have a second road going directly to Yasna Polyana, so the settlement of Yasna Polyana is likely going to see a lot of heavy fighting in the coming days over the settlement itself. Unlike Shakhtarske, Novoukrayinka and Vuhledar, Yasna Polyana does not have any fortified positions. The Russians gaining control of it would mean that they generally have a strong foothold in the northern bank of the river line, north of Solotaniva and Prichistivka, to then launch offensive operations towards Velika Novosilka and in the northeastern direction towards Maximivka and all the way up to Kurakhove, or in the northern direction as well. So there's a lot of positions, directions the Russians can move in, and there is hardly any fortified positions that the Ukrainians can make use of. They likely have a lot of positions in the forest lines with minefields being set up, FPV drones operating, and so on, but it is simply open fields with no defenses. This will mean that the Russians can launch an operation without any really people stopping them, all the way to Rusliv and Konstantinopel in the north. The Russians also advance in Novoukrayinka and the southern parts, separated by the river line, reaching the eastern outskirts of the settlements, where the Russians are slowly fighting through to gain full control of it. Again, there's fortified positions in the rear of Novoukrayinka, which the Russians have to gain control of to gain full control over the settlement. And in the eastern parts, the Russians have gained full control over Vuhledar, following the heavy fighting that took place within the settlement. There's still the eastern parts separated by a river line, which they do not have control of. And then there's fortified positions in the eastern and western parts of the settlement. The Russians will likely look to gain control over the area between Vuhledar in the east and Shakhtarsk in the west to use that as a springboard for further offensive operations in these 3 separate directions. We're already seeing indications that the Russians are attempting to test the waters in the direction of Velika Novosilka, because the Russians can launch a combined assault from Solotaniva in the east and Shakhtarske in the northeast, where yes, there is fortified positions of the Ukrainians, but the Russians would be able to flank them from Shakhtarske. The hourglass defenses here, which are protecting in every direction, would be a strong hindrance for the Russians. But if they gain control over that, they will have a fortified position that overlooks the settlement, and they'll be able to gain control over the southern and northern parts of the Velika Novosilka area if they do a combined assault by capturing the fortified positions near Sremayorsk and push in the direction of Remivka as well, flanking the positions along the Remivsky ledge. The Russians would be able to bypass a lot of these settlements near the front line and simply go for big prize, flanking multiple settlements. The Russians have not really made so many risky operations, but considering their recent advances here near Vuhledar, which has significantly grown in scale, they might attempt some of these more risky operations, especially with the recent one flanking Shakhtarske to bypass it along the river line. The Russians also made a small advance here near Katerinivka. Further north, the Russians advanced in the direction of Kurakhove along from Hirnik. There's been some positional fighting. Now the Russians are connecting the roads between Suryane and the south of Hirnik, as they continue pressuring the Ukrainian positions within Kurakhove. Kurakhove itself has some industrial areas in the central parts, but other than that, there's no apartment complex areas, simply residential areas all the way to the southern parts. And this means that Kurakhove will not be any massive defensive position. The Russians will not stand too long to capture it. It will be quicker and easier than Hirnik for the Russian soldiers. Instead, there is the industrial area to the west, which would be more difficult than Kurakhove itself. And then the Russians would have, at that point, captured the eastern parts, moved down along towards the northern parts of Kurakhove, and slowly the Russians gain control over the northern bank of the Vuhledar river line. The Ukrainians set up proper defensive positions to prevent a encirclement of their forces here in the east, but this meant that they simply did not have enough forces to hold their positions in the east, and slowly withdrawing bit by bit, it weakens further, and the Russians take advantage of that to then advance through these positions, while at the same time bombarding the Ukrainian forces escaping from Kurakhove and the pocket. In the western direction, the Russians have stormed Novodimitrovka from Selidova along the main road, capturing the fortified position, facing in the southern direction, and moved through towards the settlement, reaching the central parts of it. Combined with their foothold in the eastern parts, the Russians now control half of Novodimitrovka, and they'll look to gain control of the remaining parts and Surya, moving through the settlements. This will cut off further connections between the north and the south as the Russians move further south towards Seriterny. So there's a wider attempt at flanking and cutting off the Ukrainian forces here north of Kurakhove. At the same time, the Russians will launch offensive operations west of the settlement of Selidove to really gain full advantage from the capture of the settlement. And if we take a look at the southern parts, it's very easy to see that the Russians will look to gain control over the roads, just move along it, and from the southern direction to connect at Constantinople and Rivka in the north. This will cut off the entire pocket here by Kurakhove. So there's a lot of developments that are going to be taking place in the future following the capture of Selidove and the capture of Vuhledar. They both have about an equally significant effect on the front line in terms of what is possible following the capture of these settlements. To understand the significance of what is happening, Vuhledar was a settlement that the Russians fought over for over 2.5 years. Following the capture of Vuhledar, the Russians have been able to advance in just 1 month to what they had advanced in half a year. So there was a significant speed up in the amount of both speed, territory captured, and everything else in that regard, improving in favor of the Russians following the capture of Vuhledar. This is what the Ukrainians had of their own advantage once they held Vuhledar. Selidove would have a similar effect on that section of the front line. Velika Novosilka would have a similar effect, and Kurakhove would have a similar effect. This means capturing Velika Novosilka and Kurakhove would essentially lead to the Russians gaining full control over the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region, allowing them to reach the Dnieper region, Zaporizhia region from the rear, flanking it, or expanding the front line towards Pokrovsk. All of these three things would happen if the Russians capture Kurakhove and Velika Novosilka. And these two captures, Selidove and Vuhledar, will even allow the Russians to flank Kurakhove and cut off supplies going to Velika Novosilka from the north, flanking that settlement as well, but not encircling it. So we see that there's significant advantages to be gained following the capture of these settlements, and it is sort of a domino effect. The more they capture, the easier the front line becomes, and the more they can capture to then proceed with the cycle. If the Russians expand the front line near Pokrovsk from the eastern parts to the southern parts as well, it will be about half of the front line covered, and that will allow the Russians to have a much better position to storm Pokrovsk. If they also cut off the western road and expand the front line even further, potentially even cutting off the northwestern roads, they would isolate Pokrovsk from supplies coming from the Dnieper region, from the Zaporizhia region, generally from western Ukraine, they'll be able to have a large effect on the siege of Pokrovsk, heavily bombarding it with FAB bombs, similar to Avdiivka, dropping 100 a day. That would completely devastate and decimate the Ukrainian defensive positions and defensive capabilities within Pokrovsk, and that will lead to a quick capture similar to Avdiivka, where they slowly inch forward to the outskirts of the city, after which, with heavy bombardments, the Ukrainians are simply forced to withdraw due to limited supplies and heavy casualties from these bombs. And again, if Selidove and Vuhledar have such a significant effect on the front line, what sort of effect will Pokrovsk have on the front line? Well, the Ukrainian defensive positions will all be flanked in the Donetsk region. The Russians will be able to go to Kramatorsk, they will be able to go to Slaviansk from the rear, they will be able to go to Barvinkove, cut off the railway that goes through that settlement. They'll be able to move all the way to Izium, the southern flank of it. They'll be able to go to the Dnieper region, Pavlograd, Dnipro itself, flank Zaporizhia from the rear. The Ukrainians are setting up multiple defensive lines around Zaporizhia in the eastern and northern direction, fearing that the Russians will flank them from the rear. That is to the point where they fear the fall of Pokrovsk, because there's just an open road between Pokrovsk and Dnipro. So we see that the effect of Pokrovsk would be very devastating for the Ukrainian forces. They already do not have enough forces to cover the entire front line, and the front line would become that much more difficult to defend if the Russians gain control over Pokrovsk. In the northern direction, the Russians have now moved into Torske. In the northern direction, they first gained a foothold in the farm area. The Ukrainians counterattacked, regaining control of it. Following that, the Russians then moved on to the northern parts, gaining a foothold in the outskirts, and heavy fighting continues here in the Tursk direction, both in the eastern and northern parts of the settlement. And the Russians will likely continue moving through Terny in the north. Now the Russians have cut off the connection here in the south, and they will likely look to close off this pocket that is now being formed by Yampolivka and Terny, potentially with a combined strike, but likely just from the northern direction and down south to connect with the Russian foothold in Torsk. Finally, in the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Russians are capturing half of Shakhtarske in a single assault, moving along the railways. The residential areas previously mentioned, it's just a few houses, larger gaps between them, and unlike Sinkivka, which has a similar layout, Sinkivka is isolated. There's a forest area near it, there's fortified positions, it's close vicinity to Kupiansk, covering it with drone and artillery fire. Shakhtarske is more combined with Kruhlyakivka. It's a railway and forest area that connects the two, and there is no close proximity to a large settlement, which the Ukrainians can use to cover Shakhtarske with artillery fire and FPV drones, so it's limited what capacity they have to defend, and this is leading to the Russians slowly advancing towards Kurova from the north. Combining that with an assault from the east, the Russians would be able to create a new pocket with a few settlements in between the gaps, capturing this entire area and cutting off another crossing across the Usk River line. They now have physical control over the crossing by Sinkove. They've isolated the crossing by Kupiansk. Cutting off the crossing by Kurova as well would mean that there's only the Usk River crossing and the Kupiansk crossing. The Kupiansk is isolated, so the Liman direction would be supplied through this singular crossing by Uskil, and Russian forces moving to flank that by moving further down south along Kurova, crossing the Serbis River line. They would be able to cut off Liman completely from supplies. So we're going to be seeing a lot more fighting here in the east of Liman, both in the forest area, the Srebrenki forest area, and the Serbis River line. This will allow the Russians to encroach on Liman from the east, while at the same time we'll see a lot of fighting along the Usk River line to cut the supplies, to force a Ukrainian withdrawal from Liman, or to simply weaken the defenses to then flank it from the rear, or do a combined strike, or simply siege Liman to regain control of it. We're seeing that the Russians are moving in on a specific direction to gain full control of the Donetsk region, and that is clearly to flank the Kramatorsk, Konstantinivka, Sloviansk line. The Russians simply see this as an impossible defensive line to overcome. They simply cannot storm it head on. So their objective is to gain control over Chasiv Yar that overlooks the defensive line, to allow for heavy bombardment on it, slowly grinding it down, but doing that would simply take too long. It would mean that they would have to, well, we take a look at Vuhledar. It is a small settlement, 10,000 people. It took the Russians 2.5 years to bombard it enough to gain control of it. How much would they have to bombard the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line to gain control over that? So it's clear that fighting it head-on does not make any sense. The Chasiv Yar capture would simply be to grind down the Ukrainian forces, but the real efforts to capture this line comes from Pokrovsk in the south and Izium in the north. The Russians would look to gain control over both of these settlements. Following that, they would look to connect the two by Barvinkove, cutting off all supplies and encircling the Donetsk region. However, this is also risky. They may leave a gap in the Ukrainian lines to allow them to retreat, because them retreating would be much more beneficial for the Russians than them staying and delaying. So instead, we can see two outcomes. If the Russians attempt this, they would either completely encircle or operationally encircle the entire Donetsk region. For this, they would need to gain control of the eastern parts of the River line, push through towards Izium to gain control over that, and then push towards Barvinkove from the north, gain control over Pokrovsk, and move towards Barvinkove from the south. And that would allow for a complete encirclement. Alternatively, they would look to gain control over the southern parts of the Donetsk region, all the way towards Barvinkove, gaining control over that, cutting off one of the main railway connections, and then leaving the Izium gap open as an operational encirclement. So a strong push from the south rather than a combined push on both flanks. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.